Good evening and welcome back to Afrolantican Jurisprudence. I'm your host, Professor Smith, Smitty Ponton, Andre Smith. You know you can call me anything you want. And so we're talking about this is our third episode, and this is actually part two of the second episode, which is Black Capital Accumulation. That one was titled Towards Black Capital Accumulation. This one, I guess we'll call Defending Black Capital Accumulation because I want to address some of the concerns and criticisms that will be levied against what I'm proposing by people that I have a great deal of respect for. Again, I taught in law schools for 14 years. And many of the professors there, and particularly the ones that cared about economics at all. I lament that a lot of the professors I worked with, pretty much just ignored economics. And it's understandable. Economics is used often in law scholarship to discredit critical race theory, to discredit civil rights laws, to say that the market should make determinations instead of the government with respect to race and the distribution of resources. So, because economists have been hostile to civil rights. Civil rights activists, in my view, have then returned fire, been hostile to economics. However, I think we should be hostile to those economists, not the actual concept. As we'll talk more here, we can't afford to cede anything of value, any tool, any theory, any resource. We can't afford to cede it to white folks because they used it to subjugate us, and now we reject it entirely. Nothing in this world belongs to them, including economics. Now, for those law professors that did deal with economics, a great deal of them also propose perhaps either socialist or what some might call heterodox economics. In other words, economic systems that would replace the system or that are fairly incompatible with the system. So we're talking about a change from what is supposed to be a free market system. It's not. We're going to talk about that in detail. But this idea of a free market system to one that's I guess more centrally controlled, and all types of permutations in the middle. So uh, what we're going to do today is kind of anticipate some of the criticisms for those that believe that an Afrolantican jurisprudence should not uh, deal or concentrate or promote a free market economy, that it should promote something more controlled by the central administration, i.e., either socialism, communism, or maybe even monarchy, or even some types of religious orders, which, in my view, many religious orders are very communal. And so we'll address them when we talk about communism, although, of course, there are a lot of important distinctions. And again, I come through this through taxation. So honestly, it might be a bit reductionist, but it's very helpful to look at capitalism, socialism, communism, especially since none of them have really existed in its ideal forms. And because none of them have existed in their ideal forms, I think it helps to even conceive of them in terms of the tax structure, right? And we're going to talk about that a little later. But the point we're trying to do here is we're trying to create Afrolantican jurisprudence. We're trying to improve upon the system, make a better system. What would be the law, or what would be the jurisprudence or the economic system if Black folks had a chance to have control and self-determination over the mythical island of Afrolantica? And I propose that if we did such, that our Constitution, to the extent it resembles the American Constitution and has a right to property, and also an equal protection clause and a due process clause, or something similar, and I do suggest that it ought, that in order to protect or deal with group subordination, as this Constitution is interpreted not to, that in Afrolantica we would interpret the Constitution, we would interpret the Equal Protection Clause to allow the judiciary to recognize when the market system is asymmetrically imperfect and therefore supportive of group subordination. That rules, laws, regulations should be appropriate to fix group subordination, to fix asymmetries in the marketplace, and that interpretations, regulations, and laws that exacerbate asymmetries in the marketplace that relate to group subordination, that those are suspect and could be set aside under proper conditions. I also suggest that because of this suggestion of a rights to property, that the government should also recognize a group subordination. By doing that, I don't tend to deal with idyllic situations. We know that our attempt to eliminate group subordination is not going to be wholly successful. Our attempts to create a perfectly meritocratic system is not going to be wholly successful. So that's the whole point of injecting into the jurisprudence concepts and constructs that judges and others can use to determine when something is or is not fair. And so my principal defense of black capital accumulation, and also this concept of asymmetrical market imperfections, is that there just is never a system that we've experienced. There's none that I anticipate where group subordination and capital are unimportant, right? We'd like that to be, but just as some folks would prefer to think about to not deal with race, to not deal with capital, I think that we have to take these things head on if we're to get anywhere. So again, this is, but let's also remind that this is me presenting my version, and I definitely encourage others to promote theirs. We're going to hopefully have some responses, one from the good Professor Farley, Anthony Farley, who's written on a lot of similar subjects so I have, and looks at it from a different bent, and definitely welcome his thoughts and want to make this a project more than just myself, but to have others who are thinking about these issues deeply to contribute as well. All right, so let's go even further into detail what my defense of what we call black capital accumulation is, right? And again, I'm going to say that there is a world somewhere where neither race nor capital is important. This one is not it. And in this one, we need to better educate ourselves and our children, start and patronize black businesses, stop unduly criticizing each other. That is our task as people. However, we're also asking the government to do things to combat group subordination, i.e. racism. And in those, I am asking the government to recognize asymmetrical market imperfections. That to me will help towards black capital accumulation. I do not suggest that we don't look at racism in other contexts, such as violence or other things that are harder to categorize in economic terms. However, just as much as we are looking for equality in terms of liberty, we should also be looking for equality in terms of property. And if we're not going to push for equal outcomes generally, if we're not pushing the idea that everyone gets the same, that we are talking about meritocracy, then we need to be talking about this idea of what makes a market fair. What makes a market subordinate, and how do we make that market less subordinating, knowing that we're probably not going to be making it perfect. As I mentioned, a lot of my white colleagues that I've worked with at law schools, they want to pretend that race doesn't exist and that it isn't ubiquitous. A lot of my black colleagues, on the other hand, sometimes want to pretend that capital doesn't exist, that it isn't ubiquitous. But however, we're playing the game, and I'm proud of what we have done in the last 50 years. In my view, slavery did not end until the 1940s. Real slavery, right? De facto slavery, de jure slavery ended with the 13th Amendment. However, we know that people were still de facto enslaved under the convict leasing system. So to the extent that that didn't end until the 40s, and to the extent the Civil Rights Act didn't at least attempt to engage with a free market, to attempt to deal with asymmetries in the marketplace that were designed to subordinate black folks. That's only been 50 years since the Civil Rights Act. So I'm very proud of what we've done to try to close the racial wealth gap. But we also must recognize that the deficit that we face requires not just affirmative action, but extraordinary action. Again, if we're talking about a game of Monopoly where other people have gone around the board and gotten all the green, expensive ones, and we're dealing with the blue and purple chumpies on the side that have less value, then it is not whether we ought to engage with capital in a more efficient manner. If we're going to play the game at all, if there's any point to it, we must. So it's not. So by definition, this is not an attempt to shame black folks. We are in the situation that we are in. There is a racial wealth gap because others have more capital and they have invested it and are getting the returns on capital. Then the effort that we would have to make outside of getting reparations would have to be extraordinary. So doing what we're doing, to the extent there's nothing wrong with it, to the extent God did not make us lesser people, of course, we do find ourselves in a situation where whatever we're doing requires something more. And so this is what we're proposing. And I actually do, and I have to say this because, again, I'm not necessarily talking to any specific individual. Again, I have dealt with a lot of theorists and very intelligent people who fight for socialism, who are against black capitalism, that they find it exploitive, that it reproduces the same hierarchies that we're fighting here. But sometimes I fear that rejection of capital in its entirety, and again, we're going to talk about the difference between capital and capitalism, is reactive to a system of white supremacy, and worse, the idea that it can't be defeated, right? That it's always existed and it always will, that the essence of blackness is protesting against systems instead of creating the better one, right? An Afrocentric and Pan-African perspective is useful towards recognizing that black people successfully engage in trade and commercialism for several millennia before the European march towards white supremacy we have been experiencing over the last 400 to 500 years. White people did not invent trade, they didn't invent profit, they didn't invent capital. That they used and continue to use capital to subjugate people of color does not mean we should reject capital any more than we should be rejecting writing, weapons, religion, academic systems. None of these things belong to white people, even though each of them were used along with countless other constructs, concepts, and tools to enforce or to create and maintain white supremacy. So we're going to talk about if we're going to cede those tools. And again, with all due respect to Audre Lorde and the theorists that have thought very deeply about revolution, this idea that that you can't tear down the master's house with the master's tools, that the master owns those tools, or that the master has created those tools. They're not his to determine whether they're not the reference point for whether we use tools or not. Whether they are useful to what our purposes are is the only standard, not whether someone else has used those same tools for improper purposes. From a jurisprudential standpoint, an Afrolantican jurisprudence would include in its equal protection jurisprudence the construct of asymmetrical market imperfections to determine whether asymmetries in the structure of the marketplace produce or are likely to produce group subordination in terms of inequitable capital distribution. So even right there, as much as I am promoting a market-based system, by suggesting that we ought to incorporate asymmetrical market imperfections in our jurisprudence and allow judges to interfere in the marketplace, I'm conceding from the beginning that no, capitalism does not. first of all, it doesn't even exist. And to the extent it does exist, no, it does not fairly distribute goods and services. And that is the point of government, right? To reduce these asymmetries so that merit can flourish. Capital needs to be subordinate to merit instead of merit being subordinate to capital. I'll try to explain a little further what I mean by that a little later. And so the bottom line to me, because there is no political system, regardless whether it is called capitalism, socialism, or even communism, where accumulating capital is not important, all of these systems deal with capital. They do not reject it, and they deal with who controls it, not whether it should or should not be an object of the state. If we understand that about the differences between capitalism, socialism, and communism, then I think that the criticism of black capital accumulation pretty much withers, because we find that there is just no system there where group subordination is not possible, if not likely, and where group subordination will not be manifested in the disparate access to important resources, i.e. capital. We've seen in all the systems of the world where they have either existed or attempted to exist that white supremacy, by definition, dictates that even in those places, an inequitable share of goods and services and authority is distributed to black people, that there is an economic as well as social caste system the world over. So if we look across the globe, not just in 2017, but in 1997, 1947, 1847, that regardless in the last 400 years of what the system was called, white supremacy has been practiced there. And therefore, white supremacy, so the mission is to address and combat white supremacy, not combat capitalism or combat socialism or communism or whatever. In my view, each of those things has its own merit, and each of those things has its own disadvantages. And as I mentioned before, none of them have actually existed in perfection. So we're trying to be very pragmatic about black nationalism, and we're trying to be very pragmatic about political theory, because winning the war of ideas is great, but more than that, we need to address and understand these theories and how they operate within the United States so that we can do something real, which is reduce, again, this wealth gap to come to a place of at least some type of self-determination and lesser economic subordination. Okay, so that's the bottom line to me. I want to defend it more specifically. I know that these videos are long. I know that we go over an hour, hour and a half sometimes, and that is because what we're trying to distinguish this from, we are trying to, again, make this philosophically and theoretically consistent. The goal here is not to create slogans or cute sayings, although if some come out of there, I'm not going to be mad, but what we're trying to do is be very thorough and make sure our thing is very consistent from top to bottom. So I'll try to get a little better and maybe try to go on as many tangents, but I've promised that to my students for almost 20 years, and it hasn't happened yet, so please bear with me. So what we're doing from here forward is going to talk a little bit more in defining those particular systems, capitalism, communism, socialism. We're even going to talk about something called African feudal taxation, and I'm going to describe these systems so we know precisely what I mean by each of them and why precisely I don't think any of them mount a particular charge against black capital accumulation. Race and capital are just simply important. We just live that in a world where it just is. There's no system, past or present, that has perfected meritocracy. And that, to me, is the goal of society, right? How to distribute the goods and services that the jurisdiction offers based on merit, right? And therefore, If there is no perfect meritocracy anywhere, there is no system in which the government ought not be cognizant of racial asymmetries in the marketplace. So I don't think anything about um, having a capitalism system, not having a capitalist system, having a socialist system, a communist system, none of them excuse the government for ignoring when whatever market, however it's constructed, has asymmetries that perpetuate subordination. There is no system, past or present, in which black folks should not better educate themselves, should not engage in trade, and should just all of a sudden wantonly criticize each other. Um, Again, socialism does not ignore property. Communism does not ignore capital. It just deals with it differently. And since it exists, then black folks need to make sure that the government is, on the one hand, attuned to whether they're being distributed fairly, but it's not all the government's responsibility. And so when it comes to the agency of black people ourselves, the question becomes, how much are we willing to better educate ourselves and our children, start and patronize black businesses, and to stop unduly criticizing each other, which maintains the myth of black inferiority and skews the market in all types of ways against us. So, what is the complaint? What is the complaint against black capital accumulation? Oftentimes, you'll hear it announced as black capitalism, and I very much distinguish black capital accumulation from black capitalism. There is a distinction between capital and capitalism, right? Again, depending on who controls the resources of the state. However, I'm not scared of the word capitalism or black capitalism. I am very proud of the black entrepreneurs that have gained some success in this system. Do I wish that they would perform better, or would they do things differently than their white counterparts? Yeah, I wish that. Do I expect it? Not much. However, the question here is not whether we're just going to create a few more black billionaires. The question is whether we as black people in the aggregate from top to bottom need to be more serious about capital. And the answer to, in my view, is simply yes. If we are going to engage in this system at all, what is the alternative? Engaging in this system and not educating ourselves. That can't be the answer, I don't think. Engaging in this system and not starting black businesses and not patronizing black businesses. Is that the solution? Is the solution to just criticize each other wantonly? So we're just going to criticize each other into equality of property and liberty and what have you. So I guess the question I'm asking is, what is the alternative? Right? If we're engaging in a system where capital is important, if you cannot present to me any system where capital is not important, then the question becomes, do we acquire the capital or do we just cede it to others because capital just ought not be a thing, or it ought not be determinative of outcomes? Now, again, I have said their response to me is likely yes, but Professor Smith, you said that the point of Afrolantica is to envision the better system, that we wouldn't leave the United States of America as racist as it may be or as exploitive as it may be. We wouldn't leave here to go to someplace worse. We need to go to someplace better. And so the argument goes that if we were to, as I am doing somewhat here, taking the system as is, putting it in Afrolantica and just tweaking it by having the judiciary be cognizant of asymmetrical market imperfections, then the argument goes, you haven't created a better system. You have created a system indistinguishable from the one that is here today. And just because my master is black doesn't make it any better, right? As a matter of fact, to their credit, they would probably bring up the fact that, yes, there were black slave owners, that because the slave system, in order to engage in business in the early 18th century, to have your costs as low as others, then you engaged in holding slaves just as white folks did. Native Americans owned slaves. other black people owned slaves. There had to be laws in certain many states preventing free blacks from owning slaves, right? That's a very interesting thing, right? To protect social white supremacy, there were laws preventing free blacks from owning slaves. Wow, right? Blows your mind. And if you look at Blake, Martin Delaney's Blake, The Huts of America, and he talks about slavery in Louisiana and says that the worst slave owners were the mulatto and black slave owners in Louisiana because they were trying to always prove themselves equal to their white counterparts in commerce. And so the argument goes that they drove their slaves even harder and were even crueler because they were trying to impress on top of just trying to make money. So that is the argument in a very small nutshell. Again, I definitely will have some others present it more thoroughly. That to the extent slavery is death, to the extent this is a capitalism has not changed, that it has morphed from, I'm sorry, slavery hasn't changed, that it has morphed from chattel slavery to sharecropping to now employment, right? Under the law and your employment contract, it is still a master-servant relationship, right? Still under the law. And so the argument goes to perpetuate this system, but just determine whether the wealthy black folks have an opportunity to make as much money as the other wealthy black folks, that's not a better system. Now, I would argue that, yeah, it would. That even if, and I'm not suggesting that we import the whole system jurisprudentially and economically from here to Afrolantica. I do suggest using this as a baseline, uh, somewhat just for convenience. That's just what I'm familiar with. So that's one of the reasons why I welcome others to present theirs. But to the extent we are transporting the economic and legal system here to Afrolantica and creating at least just one jurisprudential construct that can help reduce group subordination, then yeah, it is better, right? That to participate in this market, even though it may be exploitive, even though it doesn't necessarily produce merit in each and every term, to reduce or eliminate the arbitrariness of racial distinctions, to reduce the degree with which my economic outcomes depend on race, that is a better system, even if it's just that one change. So my initial defense of black capital accumulation is that even if it's not as good, even if that better system is not the best, even if it is not the one that my colleagues are pining for, I do suggest it is the better system than we have. And to the extent I don't know what is precisely the system that they advance. I am welcome. I am more than welcome to give them space on Afrolantican Jurisprudence and to read their stuff as to what precisely do they mean when they talk about a different system. I've been very impressed with certain constructs like Robert Ashford's. He does at Syracuse University. Has written about heterodox economics and injecting into the Constitution a right to buy property with the income from such property. Right, wealthy people buy stocks and bonds, and they borrow the money to buy the stock. Right, they borrow at 5% or 4%. Then the stocks or bonds then perform at 8 or 9%, and they use that to pay the interest, and they keep the difference. And that way, they have bought the property initially, basically with the profits of such property. And because they have wealth behind them and they have a credit rating, banks allow them to do this, where you and I don't have the same. Robert Ashford argues that there should be a constitutional right for everyone to do this. Well, my question is, black capital accumulation has nothing against that, could fully support it. And to me, that sounds like that could be a system that's compatible with capitalism, that could be consistent with socialism or what have you. So throwing out these words, oh, it's socialist or it's capitalist or communist, really doesn't move me in any direction. The question becomes whether or not that system and the mechanisms within that system do they help produce merit or do they not? And to the extent decisions based on race are typically non-meritorious, asymmetrical market imperfections is my way of dealing with it, not just in the capitalist system, but I would promote that in a socialist system. I would also promote that in a communist system. And that's what we're going to talk about now. What are those systems and what would AMI or black capital accumulation look like in a communist or socialist system? Because my argument is if others promote that as the better system, I still don't see any way around um, um, capital accumulation by black people. We'll talk about that more specifically. All right. Um, so let's start again from the beginning. Meritocracy. I offer that as the goal of society, regardless of whether you call yourself capitalism, communism, socialism, feudalism, marketism. What is the idea? What is the point of joining together as people, of drawing national borders, of saying that these are my fellow countrymen instead of us just all being individuals? And I would argue that it's meritocracy, that we believe that even though we can't define merit in every particular situation, that some people deserve more and some people deserve less. That most of us do not believe that every single person on earth should have the same amount of the earth's resources. Maybe everyone should have a same baseline, and if that's socialism, I don't have a problem with that, and I don't think that still detracts from black capital accumulation. So one of the only things that I think detracts from black capital accumulation is the idea of just not having capital at all, and that's just not really feasible in the world that we live in. So the question becomes, how is this capital distributed? How are these resources distributed? So let me give you an example. Let me back up. Let me defend this idea that everybody should not have the same thing. That I am okay with certain types of inequality, right? Because that's what I am saying, right? Let's be clear. Criminals, robbers, people that hurt other people. Um, we'd like to pretend that they don't exist, but we do know some people. And on one hand, yes, we'd like to understand why they've done what they've done. We need to understand that we as a society played a role in producing this person that has done something wrong. However, this person has done something wrong. This person also has agency and responsibility. And therefore, I don't believe it is against the norms and rules of a just society to punish the lawbreakers, people that unnecessarily hurt other people, that to deprive those people of the resources other people we all that the rest of us enjoy, to deny them the same liberty, to deny them the same property under the right conditions. I'm okay with it, and I don't really think there's anybody here who is not, right? A murderer. And when I mean murder, I mean rampant murder, homicide, not justifiable murder, not they had a good reason. No, we know there are people that for whatever reason, and again, I'm sorry why it came to this point, will kill other people. And I will suggest that that person deserves much less than just your average person or someone, again, on the other side, who there are people who we've run into in our lives that do not only do they not harm other people and they try very much not to, they also help a lot of people. And yes, we could say, well, we don't know behind the back. We don't. Yeah, okay. There are some people that hurt people. There are some people that are very kind and help people. And no, I do not believe that that the government, and this is very important, that the government should use the force of the state. We're talking about violence. That the government should use its army, its weapons, or whatever to make sure and enforce that the robber, the murderer, the teacher, and the inventor all have the same amount of property, right? That one or the other has, because they have merited or deserved more than the others. And so that is actually what we're trying to get to when we're talking about a capitalist system, a socialist system, a communist system, right? In a capitalist system, if we're talking about anything, right, we're talking about allowing the goods and services to be the goods and services of this world to be distributed based on who has the most capital. Right now, again, we're going to talk about more about what that means to have capital. On the one hand, it can mean money. On the other hand, yes, it can mean weaponry. It can mean military capital as well. So we're not going to be naive about what capital means, but we also can expand it from financial capital, military capital. Then we also must accept that it also means human capital, political capital, social capital. And this is one of the reasons why this huge definition of capital means that capital and capitalism are two different things, right? Capital, human capital is what I know inside me. Social capital are the connections I have, right? Capitalism, as we know it, is basically goods and services being determined based on financial capital, right? That the government should not determine how much you get paid. That if a basketball player gets paid $30 million, a teacher 50,000, and right? That is determined by the marketplace. However, the government does in fact have opportunities to restrict those prices, and they do so through regulation, do so through taxes, right? As I've mentioned before, this purely capitalist system, this pure market system, means that there's no taxes, no transaction costs, perfect information, all types of stuff. And so we know that these things don't exist. We know that every supposedly capitalist system has had rules, regulations, barriers to entry, et cetera, et cetera. So the question becomes, does that make them not capitalist at all, right? What about socialism? Is socialism just kind of capitalism light? Are we talking about, yes, the market gets to determine goods and services, however, the government provides a social safety net, a platform, a level beyond which you cannot go underneath, right? That as a social, as a community, even if you are lazy and shiftless for whatever reason, you still get to eat. You still have clothes and whatnot. And that's great. That's fine. And we need to pass enough taxes to support that system. Yet it doesn't disavow capital. Because for those that want more than what the government provides, they're free to do so. And if we're talking about how much money capital influences the government itself, how it influences behavior, how much capital allows us to determine our lives, then a strong social system does not discourage or allow us to forego the accumulation of capital. So on the one hand, we accept the social services because we fought for the socialist system, but then yet again, we still don't educate ourselves, we still don't start businesses, and we still continue to criticize each other, so that all the extra quote unquote disposable quote unquote capital remains in the hands of others. That's not wise in my view. As a matter of fact, let's think about Cuba and other socialist regimes. Number one, uh, they prove that white supremacy does not, and racism does not just vanish because you have overthrown capitalism and you have engaged in a socialist system, right? Cuba and visitors, recent visitors to Cuba can testify that it still is colorized, that the darker people, the ones that are most associated with the African diaspora, occupy the lowest rung of society, and that when it comes to the higher positions in power in Cuba, that they are lighter in those that consider themselves Hispanics or descendant of those from Spain. So we have, and so we've seen that in a country that did in fact overthrow Western hegemony and institute a socialist or communist system, that race still preserves itself, that it still did not escape a system of white supremacy, as if the Soviet Union itself also was a heaven or haven against white supremacy. As much as they may have been or France as a socialist system, or communism or Soviet Union as a communist system, or even China, provided opportunities for blacks to escape the racism they found in the United States. Number one, they still found exploitation in the places they went to, and they also found racism and white supremacy in those places as well. I would even talk about the United States. We don't have a purely capitalist system. And some would even say, again, those that are trying to quote unquote make America great again would argue that it is socialist, that we do practice what some call white socialism in the United States of America. Consider Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal. They didn't enact all of it, but they have enacted some. So labor unions, Social Security, public school systems, these are socialistic concepts. So does that mean we're not in a capitalist system, and therefore what I'm proposing for Afrolantica isn't capitalist either? Or are we saying that a capitalist system can exist with a very robust baseline, with a very robust social safety net and services? Or are we just saying that capitalism and socialism are academic words that really just don't mean a lot? What we're really talking about is taxes. In the capitalist society, people would like to have zero taxes and let the market decide. In a socialist society, you would have many more, much higher taxes, so that you would provide these social services. And in a communist society, basically, you're saying the taxes are 100% because the government basically takes whatever you earn and then just tells you what you get to keep based on their definition of merit. And I'll say this, as much as one would suggest that capitalism is exploitive because we're talking about those with capital determining who gets further capital. And we can talk about that more specifically, but that is when we're talking about the monetary system and the Federal Reserve, we're talking about people with capital injecting capital in the system to people with capital so that they can determine who gets the rest. Sounds bad? It is. It is. There's different ways to do it. You, instead of trickle down theory, you could do trickle up theory with capitalism. But to distinguish capitalism with socialism, it doesn't mean that capital is not important. It just means that the taxes are higher. It just means that there is a higher social system. And then not only that, when we talk about communism, once again, communism does not reject capital. It just means that the state controls it and determines who gets it. And some of this is tongue in cheek, but when we consider the black intelligentsia or just intelligentsia on Facebook and social media, I don't know if I trust that system to decide who gets services and goods based on the intelligentsia's standard of what's right and wrong. I would also say this. Communism would be a system that rejects capital entirely. Well, almost financial capital entirely or whatnot. But they still, as long as it has a monetary system, there's a money system in communism. And who has more money, right? And the state gets to make that determination. So it is still pretty much not a complete withdrawal from the world systems that do require capital. I'll give you an example of a governing system that totally rejected capital. I'm from Philadelphia. If those from this area and others are familiar with the MOVE organization. As a matter of fact, Mumia Abu-Jamal, the former president of the National Association of Black Journalists, the one that's on death row as we speak, was not a MOVE member, but he was very supportive of MOVE. That is one of the reasons he was perhaps targeted and what have you. So there was, and many people remember the MOVE bombing of 1985. I actually remember the Powelton Village episode in 1978, where they bulldozed the home, had John Africa in the street, and just were kicking him in the head. And I'm watching Action News Channel 6, and they're just You can do that, right? You can just have somebody who surrendered and just kick him in the street in the head. That told me something here is different when it comes to us. Anyway, the MOVE organization was not actually beloved by black people. They lived in black neighborhoods, but because they rejected capital entirely, they did not use the city's water supply, electrical system. They did not cook their food. They were a back to nature movement in the middle of West Philadelphia. And that is when you're talking about a complete withdrawal, when you're talking about an organization with a decisional structure to maintain itself that absolutely does not depend on capital, that does not seek to compete in this world, MOVE is it. And I do not see most black folks or the academics that I work with advocating for us to adopt a MOVE type withdrawal from society. We could even go on to uh, um, well, we're going to save that for later. But again, the idea that we withdraw from society is perhaps attractive. It is one way to absent ourselves from racial competition and economic competition. We don't want to. We want to disavow race. We want to disavow capital. Well, then we can join religious orders or other types of orders that just basically reject the system. However, and I don't, however, it just doesn't seem that most of us want to give up what? Technology, right? When we join a group such as MOVE, when we join a group that rejects engagement with this society, we're giving up electricity and television and cell phones and what have you. And I don't think, regardless of whether it's in the United States or the world over, I don't know pretty much. There's very few places in this world where I think the people that have been exposed to technology are going to say, no, I want to take a system that rejects it entirely and don't want to compete for goods and services. Um, Similarly, I just want to present this. There's also there's other systems in the world besides communism, socialism, and capitalism. The interesting thing, and we're going to talk about this much later. We're going to talk about African feudalism or African feudal taxation. In a way, this was a system that was almost ubiquitous throughout sub-Saharan Africa for over 1,000 years. And the states, and I do mean states, not tribes, states, right? African statehood predates European statehood by millennia, and taxation was the means by which the state operated and held its economic system. But in those states, they did operate without a right to property. And if this is Afrolantican jurisprudence, we do have to recognize what we did prior coming to the Americas. And most likely, in most places in sub-Saharan Africa, in the between the 17th, 16th century AD and 1,000 to 2,000 years before, the central government basically collected taxes from each province by bringing them, requiring each province to produce something different. So you produce craft metals, you produce livestock, you produce grain, you produce weapons. The central government then taxed each province a portion of what they produced, brought it to the central government, and then redistributed that they collected to the other province. So that would diversify the economy. So if you produced grains, the government, you would pay in taxes the grain, but then you would receive from the government livestock, weapons, crafts, and what have you. Now, the thing of this was and the idea was that the central government was not to take anything. That's the ideal situation, right? Because the king has everything, he needs nothing. But that's the ideal. We know that in real practice, just as Karl Marx predicts, the central government keeps more for itself than it gives out to others. So you have whatever group that's controlling the central government, whatever ethnic group within the country or the nation is dominant within the central group, they get more of the resources than others. So even though it may not be quote unquote racism, we see this subordination occurring even in a system that wasn't a capitalist system, right? So even in that situation, you put me in that situation, you make me a judge of those courts, and yes, they did have them. If I'm a judge on those courts, yes, I would challenge the government when they made rules or distributions that were asymmetrically, that made the marketplace asymmetric and reinforced group subordination. And not only that, each group that's within the nation, yes, I think has a responsibility to better educate themselves, start and patronize their own businesses, and to not criticize each other so that they can create wealth for themselves. Because even in those societies, number one, the central group never remains the dominant group in perpetuity. I understand that it's been a couple hundred years with white folks on top. White supremacy has been here for several hundred, but that's several hundred out of the last 6,000 years, right? So what is today will not always be. And I want to talk about that later, because how do you prepare for that? Does not educating ourselves prepare for whatever future changes occur? Does not patronizing businesses, does not starting businesses, does not engaging in trade prepare us for whatever comes next? Does routinely criticizing each other for every single thing, does that help us prepare for when technology changes and the world upsets itself and the meek inherit it, right? Every time we see a new technology, we see social upheaval. We see difference in who is reigning at the top or differences in the middle. We can go back all the way to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt lasted for 3,000 years, but by the time of its end, technology such as catapults, technology such as writing, technologies such as papyrus, technology such as wheeled carriages and what have you, chariots and all of that. That is what allowed others to surpass Egypt, even though they had been the dominant power in the world for 3,000 years. And even during those 3,000 years, it was not always sweet. Right. So no matter what the economic system, what you call it, where it is, there is never, I can't think of any time period past, and I don't anticipate in the future where race is not important, even if that's what we would like, and where capital is not important, even if that's what we would like. Let me also offer a functional defense of capitalism, right? That one is kind of theory based on that capital accumulation is consistent with these theories of governance. Let's talk about just why we need it today. It's just plain useful. Now, I'm going to take a jab at those who criticize black capital accumulation because, well, again, the distinction between black capital accumulation and capitalism is regardless of what system you operate in, black folks need to be thrifty, save more, educate each other more, start businesses, build up our skills. There is and to suggest that we ought not, the academics that are doing so engage in these activities in their own personal lives. They do save money. They don't spend money wantonly. They do, in fact, find it beneficial to treat their property, first of all, to accumulate it, to get it, and then not only that, to hold it and use it efficiently. So extending that just from one's personal life to that of the race, I don't see the objection other than to say, call it capitalism rather than capital. Let's also recognize that even, and I'm going to call them from here forth my black radical friends or black radicals, to the extent they do not seek more black billionaires or millionaires or black corporations or businesses or what have you, to the extent that protest and anti-subordination efforts have to be done through public coalitions and through government, don't those require capital, right? Number one, we know that politicians respond to, first of all, their campaigns need money to run. Secondly, and because of that, they take donations, and we know that they are responsible to those who donate. Yes, it is very important for us to show up at a rally, to show up at our Congress's office, to write letters and telephone calls. But to think that is replaces or obviates the need to contribute to political campaigns, or to ignore the fact that contributions to political campaigns have to be combated by rallies and phone calls and whatnot. Capital is important. It is functional. It has uses. It gets us where it gets people where they need to go in this world and in others. So, in order to engage in political activity, to engage as activists, activists have to keep the lights on. So, as much as they are idyllic as grassroots activists, they also know that they have to get fundraising from people with capital. They can't fulfill their goals of environmental justice, of environmental regulation, or LGBT or whatever, unless they have the capital to operate their organizations. And the interesting thing is, we as critical theorists, in a sense, it is interesting for critical theorists to argue against capital, because we, in our essence, and critical legal theory, let's take a stab at our critical legal theory, not just critical race theory, but critical legal studies. They argue that the law is not self-contained, right? The formulas say that law is formally created, it reproduces itself, right? That textualism, formalism, and those constructs are imminent, right? And that realism that basically most progressives or neoliberals promote is also part of the law project, and that those constructs determine how judges decide cases. Critical, and even the content of the law, like logic and whatnot, and economics, and all those things that are stated are actually how the law is created. Critical legal study says, yeah, that's bullshit, right? That power is behind all of these rules. Power is behind the interpretation of textualism. Power is behind intentionalism. Power is behind law and economics. Power is behind purposivism. So even if the stated reasons are these, right, behind is the propagation of elites. And this is consistent with what we call an autopoetic conception of things, that what things, including the law, are systems of discourse, right? And the discourse then melds its other and creates forms that reproduce more discourse. So the law produces more law. And things that are outside of the law, it sees outside of itself, it can see reality, and it's up to people like me to inject constructs like asymmetrical market imperfects so that the law can see outside of itself and see and recognize racism, right? So law is this thing. It is separate from its environment. All things are things, and they're separate from their environment. However, the things from its environment outside of it push and influence the thing, right? Things outside the people, right? Power outside of the thing inject discourse into each system, law, hip hop, and whatnot, to make that you could call it corrupt, or influences the thing into reproducing that which serves elites. That, to me, is how we link the theory of autopoiesis with critical legal studies. And if we do that, what's the implication? The implication is, yes, you are right that the law is not pure. It has to be, it is controlled and influenced by those who inject discourse. And how do they do that? With capital. those with more capital get to inject more discourse into the body and help influence those things, whether it's hip hop, whether it's law or whatnot. And if black folks are to be able to have their equal determination in what this country is, if black folks are going to be able to determine who they are or who we are, then we're going to need capital even under these critical theories. It necessitates it. Otherwise, we cede it to others for them to determine, oh, because I am the corporation that produces hip hop, that I get to now push into the discourse the fact that blackness is prurient, has no discount rate, is hypersexual and violent, right? We need capital to combat that, to have our own radio stations or put our people in places of power that can combat those types of negative images and stereotypes. Um, I would also say again that the defense of capital in a societal, in a macro sense for society is with technology and defense, right? That even when we see a Cuba, when we see a Soviet Union that and a China that attempted to have a social system that wasn't free market based, that they found themselves technologically and therefore militarily subordinate to the United States and other capitalist societies. So even if even if I were to concede that communism, socialism, African feudalism, and other types of systems are more moral, are morally better systems to the extent that they fail to survive because of their clashes with capitalism, then it's hard for me to then just cede the need to accumulate capital and engage with the capitalist system or have enough to even defend ourselves against one. And again, I want to reiterate the point that an Afrocentric perspective helps here, right? An Afrocentric perspective when it comes to capital and capitalism, especially that distinction between capital and capitalism, is very important to me. Nothing belongs to them. Capital does not belong to white people, right? This is the importance of the battle over Egypt, right? If some people say, well, who cares, right? Whether Egypt was black or white, whether it was African, whether it was West Asian. Well, it matters to me and it matters to Afrocentrics and others. It's very important to us because if it is in fact true that ancient Kemet, especially the Old Kingdom, the one that created the monuments, they also created archives, contracts, laws, trade, taxes, and whatnot, rights to property. This is as early, these are the first six dynasties. We're talking 5,000 years ago. If these are African peoples that created these systems, that originated these systems, then there's no way we can then in 2017 say that black people need to reject trade, reject commerce, reject capital because that's white supremacy. Well, white people used it just as black people used it, just as Mansa Musa used it, right? Are we to not be proud of the accomplishments of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the fact that black folks had a great deal of self-determination, and I know that can be contested with the Muslim influence, and I'm ready for that because the all of the Muslim scholars that visited West Africa throughout its history complained bitterly about how they were Muslim in name, but retained most of the character of previous societies. And they include the Mandan Charter in Ghana that gave people rights to property, equal rights amongst individuals. And so I am just as proud of ancient Kemet. I'm proud of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai and the wealth that they created. I understand that there was subordination. I understand that there was even slavery in those instances. No, am I trying to reproduce that? No, I'm trying to find what we did best. And that did involve engaging in trade, but also avoid what we did worse. And our wealth declined when we drew arbitrary distinctions between people, when we didn't respect women as their own legal person, when we weren't the world leader in basically equal protection. Um, and I would even bring that forward to today. If we're going to say that capital and capitalism are the same, if the accusation is that accumulating capital and capitalism just reproduces the same hierarchies, then and not only that, if there is no gray, if there is no black or white to the, I'm sorry, if there is no if it is just yes or nay, yay or nay, then how do we deal with the black barbershop? Right? The black barbershop that has educated themselves into that starts a business, that patronizes business, or a black restaurateur that has a small soul food shop. Are they? I suggest that they are advancing the cause of black capital accumulation. That they could be possibly providing jobs and employment. Hopefully, that they help destroy the myth of black inferiority, that they are building their skills as far as their financial well-being. Um, to say that black capital accumulation is by itself black capitalism, and that black capitalism is evil and exploitive, then that condemns the black barbershop owner. I don't see that. I find that um, that black folks that start businesses, that engage in commerce, are to be praised and not to be um, discouraged, and definitely not uh, disparaged when they hit a certain level that affords them a certain freedom and liberty. Yes, I would like them to contribute. The Oprah Winfrey's, the Michael Jordans, I would like them to contribute more to what I think they ought, but at the same time, to the extent I don't want people telling me what to do with what I've earned, I can make suggestions, but I don't think it is wise to have the power of the state run by supposedly who? Me? An academic and other academics and politicians and the folks that you see writing articles all over Facebook and whatnot, that we are supposed to then be the government and determine how much this person is supposed to make, how much they're supposed to spend, where they can, what they're supposed to say and do. I think we're seeing through Facebook and social media how repressive certain progressive politics can be, and that there has to be, on the one hand, a recognition that we want a fairer world, that we want to end subordination. At the same time, we as black folks are pragmatic, and as much as we enjoy the progression of society, we also enjoy our own liberty. I know I do. um, and then last, let me say this about, so that's a kind of a historical defense of capital. Let's also talk about a future defense of capital. And I really think this is important because, to me, let me give you what I think is the hardest argument against black capital accumulation that can be presented, that it just doesn't matter. Right? That no matter how much we better educate ourselves, start black businesses, and stop criticizing, if the goal is acquiring money, we can't win. Right? That's a harsh thing to say, but again, let's look at Monopoly and see what we're saying. That if we are the player that's been excluded from the game of Monopoly for 20, 30 rolls, and all we have are the little blue chumpies on the side, that even no matter how much you may want to win the game, that if the game is rigged against you, there is just not going to be a victory. And so, no matter how cunning you are and how strategic you are, oftentimes, if other people have Boardwalk, Pacific Avenue, and all that, and all you have is Oriental Ave, and even St. James Place, you're going to get put out of the game. So, what's the point in even trying this? And again, from Rastafarianism to certain levels of hip hop, there's different ways to withdraw from this system if one feels that way. And I have a certain affection for that argument. That is one of the reasons why I don't berate people. I consider myself hip hop, and to the extent there are people that are that have no discount rate, that spend profligately because they believe that they're not going to live really to see tomorrow. I actually don't find that irrational. So to me, that is the most critical argument against black capital accumulation. We even see Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, that because wealth, so much wealth has been accumulated at the top, that even amongst white folks, the amount that their property, the amount that their investments are going to make for them over time is going to be more than most of us earn over our lifetimes, and therefore the richer will just continue to get richer, the poor will continue to get poorer, and as Sandy Darity has written, unless we get reparations, there really will not be any closing the wealth gap. Okay, well, so that's to me the strongest argument against concentrating on black capital accumulation. But here's my response in two parts. Number one, what's the alternative? Right? What's the alternative? Number one, and part B of what's the alternative is we have done this before. As I mentioned before, ancient Kemet rose and fell. Ancient India rose and fell. Ancient China rose and fell. White supremacy, the American Republic, Europe or whatever, it rose, it'll fall. What will replace it? We don't know. And so that brings me to the next point. Not only can the same system accommodate changes within it, as far as who holds the power, because we've seen that again in societies in the past, more importantly, technology disrupts things a lot. One of the reasons the United States overtakes Europe, right? There was never an intent for white folks to move to America and then America overtake Europe. That was not in the plans, right? But it happened, right? So the idea that these people that are being kicked out of Europe, and some of them literally were being kicked out of Europe, that they were on the bottom rung of Europe, that these meek inherited the earth by coming to the United States and being the place that does what? Exploits electricity. Think about how fundamental this one simple change in technology changes the world. That from the 18th century forward, if you have technology, you have electricity, you are modern. If you do not have electricity, you are now primitive. And whoever now is modern then subjugates and subordinates those who are primitive. And we're talking about one invention, electricity, that spawns thousands of others, right? Then we have computer technology and others, nuclear technology. We don't know what the next technology is. As a matter of fact, Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize winning economist, I've mentioned him a great deal, he argues again that the wealth of the nation is human capital. Right? Not financial capital, because again, we could all decide tomorrow to all buy Bitcoins and then the dollar just be worthless. So the ruble would just be worthless. Currencies can change, but what the people in your society are able to do, their knowledge base of mathematics, their ability to interact with each other, human capital, social capital, these things are truly wealthy. If, for whatever reason, the whole system blows up by a nuclear bomb from another planet. I don't know, aliens invade, and for whatever reason we have to start fresh, or that we just get placed on a whole new world, then how are the goods and services now going to be redistributed? If we don't have human capital, even if the initial distribution is fair, we're going to lose it, right? Because those with more capital, with more know-how, are going to eventually, in the long term, gather more of the resources for themselves in trades than those with less capital. And human capital being that what you know, that what you're able to do, and how much you're able to help others is a very, very integral part of human capital. And so therefore, accumulating capital, my prescription for black capital accumulation is not just make money, is not just get money, it's better educate ourselves and our children, start and patronize black businesses, and also to stop unduly criticizing each other. That is designed towards all capital, right? Financial capital, social capital, human capital, political capital. And so here we've gone over an hour. I know you are tired of hearing me talk, and so what I would like to do is end this here and invite those who still believe that a more socialistic society, a more communistic society, a more religious society, any of them, what is your version of Afrolantican jurisprudence? And I'm giving the challenge that when I'm talking about the better system, how do you present your how does your system prohibit or prevent racial or groups discrimination or group subordination, and then also how does that focus on group subordination also help enhance the wealth and the fortunes of the country. That is the purpose of Afrolantican Jurisprudence. I welcome other alternatives and how we can specifically maintain it, and until then, we're going to continue moving forward, talking about asymmetrical market imperfections, about black capital accumulation, about how we're going to inject jurisprudential concepts into the mythical island of Afrolantica to create a better economic, socio-legal system. Thank you again for hanging out with us. We will be back later talking more specifically about what I mean by asymmetrical market imperfections in the free market. So now that we've defended this idea of black capital accumulation, let's talk about more the nuts and bolts about what I mean about making sure the supposedly free market actually respects or actually produces the merit that it claims to produce by dismantling the barriers towards equitable competition, i.e., the asymmetrical market imperfections that relate to race. All right, good night, and see you guys in a couple of days.